Hello and welcome to the Amiga Art School. Today I'm going to be talking to you about lay-in washes and resist techniques. Jackie's already gone through some colour theory with you, and this is slightly different in that we're not really going to be looking at the colour so much as the technique. How do you lay a wash that's lively and allows the paper to shine through? So it's going to take a bit of practice, but I'm going to show you some fairly simple techniques which I hope you find useful. Okay, so we're going to start by painting some flat washes, and I've got a china plate at the ready, which I like to use. It gives me lots of space to work in, and you can get some good washes worked up quite quickly. I've squeezed out some French ultramarine from a tube, and some cadmium red, which I'm going to use later. I mean, you can use pans, but I find that they tend to be a bit slower and you have to spend quite a lot of time working them up. I've got water and a size 12 paintbrush, or you could use a size 10 if that's what you've got. And I've drawn out 4 squares, and I'm just going to show you a couple of techniques as to how you can lay a flat wash in each of them. So in other words, the result will make the square look as though it's got a fairly even coating of this dark blue paint. So before you get going, you need to spend a bit of time mixing your paint, and don't be shy of using both paint and a fair amount of water. Very often people don't put enough of either out, and you end up with a wash that's a little bit too dry, or you might find that the wash is a bit pale. I mean, even here I think I might have been a bit mean with the paint. I'm just going to put a bit more out. So another square here. You can always leave some of the pigment at the edge, so you don't have to use it all at once, but it's always good to have a fairly strong mix. So can you see how the paint is swirling around the surface? So I know it's not too dry. Okay, so with a brush that's got plenty of paint on, I'm going to go from left to right, recharge, left to right, left to right, left to right. I'm right-handed, but if you're left-handed, obviously you can go in the opposite direction. So let's try that again, maybe make it a bit neater this time. Left to right, left to right. Keep charging the brush. Okay, so the other technique you might want to try is to put the paint on a little bit more less carefully. So you're just laying the paint down on the surface, so it sort of almost pools on the surface of the paper, but it's not quite such a regimented means of working. I'll just try it one more time over here. Looks like a bit more paint. So don't go over what you've already painted, because every time you touch the surface of the paint, that little mark will show when it dries. Okay, so those are those flat washes I painted earlier. I've been a bit untidy here. I'm sure you can do better than that. But you can see how the paint is dried relatively flat, and the surface of the paper just comes through slightly, and this is where I sort of pulled the paint on the paper, and you can see it's not quite so even, but again it's relatively flat, so I'm quite pleased with those. Now I'm going to show you another wash that's probably most associated with watercolour, and that's wet on wet. And the idea is that you still put down a flat wash. So I've mixed up some more paint, ready to go. left to right, left to right. Bit of a tidy up. Get it nice and square this time. And before it dries, I'm going to drop in some concentrated pigment. So it's a little bit stronger than the pigment or the paint on this side. And just drop it into the square. And can you see how it's slowly dispersing into the paper? So let's try another approach. And this time we're going to put a flat wash left to right until about halfway, and then what you could do is wet the surface of the paper. It's still got some blue on the brush, but you'll start to see how the paint from above, especially if you add a bit more into here, will bleed down into the paint or the water below. Yeah. The other thing you can do is introduce another colour, so that's why I put out that cadmium red earlier. And again, just put on a flat wash. And then before it dries, wash your brush and get plenty of red paint. And then drop that into the surface of the blue paint. And you'll start to see how that disperses. And you can even throw the paint down if you like. Okay. And again, you might try perhaps putting the red down first. Wash your brush and then pick up some blue and, providing the red is reasonably wet, the blue will start to creep into the red paint. In theory it should almost, if you tease it along, it should almost go into, cover the red almost completely. Now those wet on wet washes have started to dry now, so you can start to see the really interesting effects you can achieve. And that's just using the blue. But they're almost like mini pictures in themselves, aren't they, which I find quite exciting. So what I want to do now is just explore you putting some of these techniques to use. So for instance, with the flat washes, you can create some fairly abstract type designs. So you're practicing, but also having a bit of fun using the medium. So if we divide, say, this area here up into a series of squares, you could make a flat square here of that tone, and then maybe add a bit more water to your paint. And have a lighter square at the bottom. But what you need to do is leave a tiny gap between the two squares, otherwise they will run into each other. So you see just a tiny gap there. And then with this section, maybe make it a little bit darker again. But again, leave a tiny gap so they don't run into each other. And then for the last one, maybe get a really strong piece of paintwork, and so almost undiluted pigment. So that's really quite strong there. The other thing you might try is create almost a free-form shape. And then put in another shape inside it. But again, just leave a tiny gap so you can create these hard edges. Oh, there you are, I see it's bled into the other side there. I didn't leave enough gap, but you can start to see how the paint runs into each other. But yeah, just leave a tiny gap there. So that's a flat wash, and various ways you might use them. Maybe do a mixture now. So we do a flat wash around the edge, almost like a frame. And then we'll do a bit of wet on wet in the middle. So we've got blue around here, and just need to squeeze out some red. Work up the red a little bit. And pop that in the middle. Starts to look like a bit like a target, doesn't it? But can you see how it's starting to bleed into the blue on the outer edges? And then you might do something similar with the red. Frame that. And then this time introduce the blue. But then you might have some part where it sort of blends into the red around the outside. But as you can see, there's loads of ways of playing with the paint, and personally I would spend a good hour practicing the flat washes, doing lots of them so you really become familiar with them. And then the same with the wet on wet. I mean, they're not quite so complicated, you could probably get those working fairly quickly. But then maybe do a whole series of squares with lots of different of these abstract patterns. Try not to make them too representational, because very often that can start to look a bit odd, but just concentrate on almost abstract forms and patterns and see what you can achieve with them.